It was supposed to be a small, ordinary thing, the kind of thing families use to avoid the question of who cooks, who cleans, and who apologizes for last week's argument. Takeout. A shared compromise. A warm cardboard bridge that could cross the distance between tired parents, sugar-fueled kids, and the slow stickiness of an ordinary weekend evening. But ordinary is a fragile thing with the wrong people. Ordinary bends at the edge of routine, and in that bend, tiny decisions become detonators. The night began like a photograph of comfortable domestic life. The sofa occupied by half the family. The TV murmuring a show nobody was actually watching. The smell of laundry detergent mixed with the faint tang of last night's sauce. My sister arrived on time, loud and certain, the sort of person who fills rooms without meaning to. She had her 2 kids with her, boisterous, slightly spoiled by the rhythm of being asked first, used to attention arriving like a spotlight the moment they opened their mouths. "Let's just order in," she announced. "What does everyone want?" It sounds harmless. It was presented as a neutral question offered into the room like a spare fork. But what does everyone want is a question that arranges people into order even when it pretends to do the opposite. The sequence of being asked, who gets the microphone first, is the tiny architecture of power in a family. My sister asked her kids first. She didn't pause to be fair. She didn't glance at us or check the way my children were watching. She asked her kids first because that's the map she follows. Her children are the compass point, the center for decisions even when the map should be shared. Her kids erupted with wish lists. Pepperoni pizza, curly fries, an order of garlic bread so big it could be a centerpiece. They spoke with the confidence of those accustomed to being first. Their demands weren't loud in the crude sense, but precise and immediate. The room leaned toward them, as rooms filled with habitual choices often do. My parents chuckled. My sister kept her voice bright, letting her kids run the menu. My children, small, polite, trained by years of shared custody and quiet endurance, sat waiting. Waiting is a strange, concentrated emotion when you're young. It sharpens and lengths like a held breath. You don't yet have the language for indignation, so you feel the edges of it in your chest. My son's foot tapped under the coffee table, a staccato that might have been nerves if it had been anything else. My daughter practiced smiling with eyes that said the exact opposite. At first, I told myself it was nothing. I told myself the simplest explanations. My sister forgot. She was used to prioritizing her kids. It would be our turn in a minute. But the room rearranged itself more quickly than altruism could catch up. Orders were suggested, votes cast in murmured suggestions, and a tone of consensus formed around the breakfast for dinner brand of choices my sister's kids wanted. Kids are small detectors. They notice the angle of attention, the tilt of a voice. In the span of 3 minutes, a small voltage passed between my children. Their faces hardened with a set of resolve that was big for their size. The thing about children is they register ceremony. Whoever gets asked first, whoever gets picked, receives a tiny coronation. Having no coronation feels like being removed from the family story. What happened next was not a tantrum. Revenge index does not live in tantrums. It lives in the slow burn that follows a contained slight. My daughter shifted in her seat. She whispered, barely moving her lips, to my son. Their whisper had that neat efficiency children invent when they're both practiced and determined. She said 3 words that made my chest tighten. "Let them have it." The words were not surrender. They were a signal. I watched from the other side of being both parent and observer. My heart wanted to step between the tiny injustice and settle it with compromise or bargaining chips. But I knew something else was happening under the surface. There are those moments you catch as an adult. A glance, the way 2 children align like conspirators. And you know you are witnessing the birth of strategy. This wasn't about food anymore. It never is when a pattern is being reinforced. This was about sending a message. The message that they matter, the message that they will be counted. And when kids feel counted out, they often find a way to write themselves back into the ledger. I tried to intervene with irony, an offhand joke about splitting the order. I suggested a rotation system of alternating who picks next time. My sister laughed too easily and said, "We asked them first this time. We'll do whatever works." It was dismissive, not overtly cruel, but dismissiveness is a kind of erasure. My suggestion hung in the air like an unpaid bill. No one paid it, so the decision marched forward. The menu choices were made. Phone screens flickered as the order was placed. The whole thing should have been over. Food will come, plates will be handed out, napkins will be fluffed. But beneath the mundane motions, something quiet and dangerous was organizing. My kids exchanged a look that wasn't childish. It was the look people get when they agree on a tactic. It was a look I recognized in myself, the cool squeeze of determination that precedes action. I had not raised them to manipulate. I had raised them to notice injustice and to respond in precise ways. They did not shout or cry. They undertook a plan. That plan started small. While we waited for the delivery, my daughter began to change the dynamics at the table by the simplest tool available to a child: storytelling. She started asking about trivial details in a voice that was bright, factual, and slightly louder than usual. She inquired about the sauce, the time the delivery would arrive, and then moved to questions only children ask to wedge themselves back into the circle. Does everyone get their favorite topping? Even Auntie June? The voice was casual, but the effect was deliberate. Attention began to return to our side of the couch like a tide. When that didn't fully work, the plan moved to stage 2, subtle sabotage. My son, who had been quiet, found a forgotten bag of chips and made a show of his appetite. He munched and murmured as if he had not been hungry at all, while his sister's choices were discussed. The point was not to protest. It was to manufacture scarcity. He paused, mock distressed, at the sight of an empty plate near him, as if the universe had conspired to neglect him. The adults noticed. "Oh, don't worry," my mother said softly, as if smoothing a careless wrinkle in a beloved blanket. "We'll make sure everyone gets something." But those words landed differently now. They were too late to stop the buildup. People had already mentally distributed portions, pre-scaled to the first requests. Kind words cannot undo the shape of decisions once they are set. You could have called it petty. You could have said the children were overreacting to an unremarkable moment. But there is a scale to injustice that fits more than one example. When patterns recur, always choosing one household over another, always prioritizing certain voices, the small episodes accumulate like stones until someone uses them to build a barricade. The quiet pact between my kids was the laying of the first stones. The tension began to pulse through quiet acts. My sister's kids received their plates first, with triumphant little licks of anticipation. They ate with the cheerful entitlement of those who have never been asked to justify their share. My children ate slower, taking bites that seemed measured, timing their chewing so it could be weaponized later. Eyes met across the room like encrypted messages. And then the arrival. A knock on the door, the rustle of the delivery bag, the clink of change. The ritual of handing out boxes, the plastic steamed with grease, the tiny triumphant shrieks of the children who dove in. For a moment, the house was full of the music of contentment. But contentment is often temporary because it rests on the surface. Beneath it, resentments breathed, patient and ready. My daughter stood up when no one expected it. She crossed to the doorway and met the delivery person with a smile that was practiced and polite. She asked questions about the food with the same careful curiosity she had used earlier, accepted the bag with a bow of thanks, and then, with the choreography of someone who has practiced a move until it becomes natural, she walked past the table, looked at the arrangement of plates, and said something that sounded like a casual observation but landed like a thrown pebble. "Did anyone remember the extra napkins?" she asked. No one noticed the tone. They were not supposed to notice. But it was the kind of sentence that will test a table's politeness. It suggested carelessness, implied oversight. It suggested that while the world had been running on autopilot, someone had been neglected again. My voice intended to be neutral. "We can get them," I said, and reached for my phone to place a small extra order, not wanting to inflame the moment. But my daughter was not satisfied with being placated. She wanted a corrective that had a cost attached, something that would make the oversight visible and, crucially, inconvenient. She had watched the way decisions had rolled like a drumbeat in favor of her cousins. She wanted the drumbeat interrupted, so she spoke again, quieter this time, but unambiguous. "It's fine. We'll just wait until everyone is done." Those words were small, plain, and devastating in their simplicity. They removed the option of being smoothed over. They introduced delay, and delay is a lever. If everyone eats quickly and the kids are served, their moment of being ignored becomes a full, visible event. If the ignored must wait as everyone else is satiated, then the slight is not only felt, it is witnessed. At that, a sliver of panic passed through the adults. A microsecond of awareness that they had set a scene where some people would be served and others would be left looking. My sister laughed, sharp and uncomfortable, and reached for her phone like a reflex. Her kids, cheeks full with the familiar comfort of being first, looked up confused. The room shifted. Nobody admitted to feeling guilty. Nobody acknowledged the pact forming in silence on the couch. But the small mechanism had been set in motion. My children had created a condition that made the family's decision visible and thus contestable. It was less a plan than the shaping of a problem. And problems, once visible, demand solutions that are either generous or corrective. There was no guarantee what course the family would take. They might apologize. They might smooth everything over and set a new routine. Or they might shrug and let this small wound fester until it inflamed into something larger. That night, as people opened the cardboard lids and folded the paper flaps back like little flags, an invisible ledger had already been started. On one side, the choices made quickly, the automatic attention, the spoiled certainty of being asked first. On the other, the quiet counting of slights. The ledger of small harms that children collect without the ability to weigh them as adults do. What no one yet understood was how resourceful children can be when they decide they have been wronged. Resourcefulness feeds on oversight. It turns what adults call tricks into forms of logic. It converts boredom into strategy, and the more trivial the initial slight, the more spectacular the creative retaliation can become. I watched my children, plated and patient, and I felt old guilt and a new, strange kind of pride. They weren't going to make a scene in the way some imagine revenge happens. They wouldn't throw food or scream. They would operate with precision. They would make the family notice what had been invisible. They would make the family feel the weight of their decision in a way that could not be ignored. Across the table, my sister laughed and reached for a slice of pizza, content, oblivious. She did not yet know she had marched into the first line of a battle she had not chosen and could not foresee. The family had treated dinner like a vessel of convenience. My kids had decided to turn that vessel into a ballot box, and somewhere between the greasy cardboard and the hush of the living room, the first rules of engagement were written. The food was on the table. The curtains opened, the air thick with the comfort of grease and melted cheese. For most families, this is where the evening drifts into calm. Kids distracted by fries, adults softened by salt and dough. But this night didn't dissolve into comfort. It sharpened. Because waiting was no longer about food. It was about being seen. My daughter sat upright, her plate perfectly empty, her eyes following every hand that reached for a slice. She wasn't sulking. Sulking would have made her look powerless. Instead, she smiled politely, nodded at her cousins when they smeared their faces with cheese, even asked them how the fries tasted. But the smile was a mask, and every polite question she asked was an arrow meant to sting. "Is it good?" she asked her cousin, who nodded with greasy fingers. "Mm-hmm," came the careless reply. "Must be nice being first," she said. The words hung there, camouflaged as innocent, but they had weight. They reminded everyone in the room that she wasn't eating. The kind of reminder that forces people to shift in their seats, to avoid eye contact, to reach for another bite faster than they normally would, as if chewing could erase discomfort. My son joined the silent protest in his own way. He'd pulled a can of soda from the fridge, not one of the ones bought for the night, but the last lonely one hiding at the back of the shelf. He opened it slowly, deliberately, letting the hiss drag out like a warning. Then he sipped it with exaggerated satisfaction, sighing after each gulp as though it were the only thing keeping him alive. My sister noticed. She glanced at me with that half-smile adults wear when they think kids are acting out. But she didn't say anything. She didn't apologize, didn't try to include them, didn't adjust the order of things. Instead, she rolled her eyes slightly and went back to cutting pizza into tiny bites for her youngest. That was when I knew the line had been crossed, because children, when ignored, don't always scream. Sometimes they plot, and what began as disappointment was quickly hardening into vengeance. The signal came in silence. My daughter leaned toward my son and whispered a single phrase that I couldn't quite catch, but I saw the way his eyes lit up, the way he nodded once sharply. Their pact was no longer passive. The protest had become a plan. The first move was subtle. My daughter excused herself, walked calmly into the kitchen, and returned with a stack of clean plates. She placed them carefully on the table as though she was helping, but then she set two of them directly in front of her and her brother. Empty, untouched. A silent declaration. It was no longer about waiting for food. It was about everyone watching them wait. The effect was immediate. My parents shifted in their chairs. My father muttered something about, "Just give them their share," but my sister laughed it off, brushing crumbs from her lap. "They're fine," she said. "They're patient. They can wait." It wasn't cruelty in her voice. It was something worse. Dismissal. And that dismissal turned my children's patience into something electric. The second move came not long after. My son reached for the TV remote. No one noticed at first. The room was loud with chewing and chatter, but then the channel changed. The background sitcom laugh track vanished, replaced by a nature documentary mid-scene, wolves circling prey. My son didn't look at the screen. He looked at the table. He wasn't watching wolves. He was becoming one. The laughter around the table faltered. "Hey, put it back," my cousin mumbled through a mouthful of fries. But my son didn't. He clicked the volume up, not too loud, just enough that every crunch of a chip, every hiss of soda now had the eerie soundtrack of predators hunting in snow. It was childish theater, and yet it worked. The food didn't taste the same with wolves growling in the background. The timing of bites, the comfort of routine, everything was suddenly off. My kids had tilted the room, and my sister? She tried to play it cool, laughing nervously. "They're just messing around." She waved her hand, tried to dismiss it again. But beneath her words was a flicker of irritation, because she could feel it too. The shift. Her kids, once smug and comfortable, were now glancing uneasily at the TV, their fries suddenly less satisfying. That's when my daughter leaned in, her voice clear, sharp, and impossible to ignore. "You know what's funny?" she said, her smile still plastered on like porcelain. "When people forget who's hungry," the room went silent. Not long, but long enough. Everyone understood now. This wasn't about napkins or slices or waiting anymore. This was a declaration of war, dressed in politeness, sharpened by silence. The adults tried to laugh it off again. My mother muttered about fairness. My father suggested making another quick order. But it was too late. The balance of the room had already shifted. My kids weren't just waiting. They were building pressure. And every second that ticked by was another turn of the screw. Because the truth is, silence is louder than shouting when it's used like a weapon. I saw the storm forming. I knew the next move wouldn't be small. They had made their point with stares and silence. What came next would be something bigger, something the whole family would remember. And as my son leaned forward, his hand hovering over the stack of untouched plates, his eyes locked on his cousin, still chewing happily, I realized with a sudden chill the spark had been struck. The only question now was how far the fire would spread. The plates were still empty. The food was still in reach. And the next decision my children made would either humiliate their cousins or the entire family. The empty plates were no longer just plates. They were symbols. Every time someone reached for a slice of pizza or another handful of fries, the clean porcelain in front of my kids became louder, more accusing, like two white flags waving in defiance. The adults tried to ignore it, but ignoring a wound doesn't make it heal. It festers. My son tapped his fork gently against the plate, a slow, rhythmic clang, clang, clang. It wasn't loud, but it was steady enough to cut through the conversation. He didn't look at anyone while he did it. He just stared at the food being devoured across from him, his eyes hard. The sound was deliberate, patient, almost ceremonial. My daughter, on the other hand, leaned back in her chair, her arms folded, her smile gone now, replaced by a mask of calculation. The cousins laughed nervously at first, trying to brush it off. "What are you doing?" one of them asked, grease dripping from his fingers. My son didn't answer. He just kept tapping. My daughter finally replied for him, "He's counting." The word dropped like a stone into water. Everyone froze for a split second. Counting? Counting what? No one asked, but the silence that followed was thick with unease. My son's fork kept tapping, and suddenly it wasn't just noise anymore. It was a countdown. The room grew uncomfortable. My father cleared his throat. My mother asked about the drinks. My sister muttered something about the kids being dramatic. But their words had no anchor. The power in the room was shifting, seat by seat, second by second, toward those two untouched plates. Then came the first strike. It was simple, almost too simple to notice at first. My daughter reached for the napkins. Instead of passing them around politely, she placed them directly in front of her and her brother. She stacked them high, neat, deliberate. It wasn't about needing napkins. It was about control. She was gathering resources, securing territory, making it clear that if they weren't allowed to eat, they would at least dictate the rules of the table. "Can I have one?" her cousin asked, reaching for the pile. She didn't move. She just looked at him. Not angry, not playful, just still. The cousin hesitated, then pulled one napkin anyway. And that's when my daughter spoke, her voice quiet but sharp enough to slice through the room. "That's ours." The cousin froze. The parents chuckled awkwardly, telling her not to be silly, but the damage was done. The first boundary had been drawn. The napkins had become a line in the sand. My son's fork tapping stopped. He lifted it, placed it carefully beside his plate, and leaned forward. His voice was calm, almost too calm for his age. "Keep eating," he said to his cousins. "We'll see how long it lasts." The adults reacted with the usual dismissive laughter. "Oh, stop it! Don't be dramatic. They're just kids." But even as they spoke, something shifted. The cousins slowed down, their bites smaller, their eyes flicking nervously toward the two empty plates. The food in their hands suddenly seemed heavier, guiltier, because my kids weren't just waiting anymore. They were haunting the meal. Minutes passed, each one stretching like elastic ready to snap. The pizza crust piled up, the fry cartons thinned, the soda fizz dulled. My children didn't eat, didn't beg, didn't cry. They just sat there still, watching, every second making the others squirm more. And then, the second strike. It was my son again. He leaned over, grabbed one of the empty pizza boxes, and without saying a word, folded it shut. The sound, that cardboard snap, echoed louder than the TV. He stacked it neatly beside his chair, then reached for another half-empty box and did the same. One by one, he began closing the meal down, shutting it away before anyone was finished. "Hey, we're still eating that," his cousin protested, but my son didn't stop. He just said calmly, "Not anymore." The cousins looked to their mother for support. My sister's face flushed red with irritation. "Enough," she snapped, reaching to grab the box back. But my son's hands were firm, his stare unflinching. For the first time, he wasn't the quiet kid waiting for permission. He was the one giving it. And that's when my daughter delivered the third and most devastating strike of the night so far. She leaned forward, her voice steady, her words chosen like weapons. "You didn't care what we wanted. So now, you eat what we allow." The silence that followed was suffocating. The cousins froze, their half-eaten slices suddenly meaningless. The adults fumbled for authority, their words tripping over each other, but the room's power had already tilted. Two kids with empty plates had just turned the entire dinner into a battlefield, and they were winning. It wasn't about food anymore. It wasn't about fairness. It was about control. And as I watched my sister struggle to reassert herself, her kids squirm in their seats, and my children sit tall and unyielding, I realized something chilling. This war was no longer silent. It had begun in whispers and stares, but now it had erupted into open conflict. The first strikes had landed. The battle lines were drawn, but my children weren't finished. They were only testing the waters, because every war begins with small victories. The real devastation comes after. If closing pizza boxes and stacking napkins could shift the family dynamic this much, what would happen when my kids decided to escalate further? The room was no longer a dinner table. It was a stage, and my kids had turned it into theater. The napkins stacked like barricades, the empty plates gleaming like shields, the folded boxes like captured territory. The war had begun, and everyone in the room could feel the shift in air pressure. Thicker, heavier, charged. But my sister didn't see it that way. She thought she could end it with one sharp command. "Stop playing games and give those back," she snapped, her hand darting toward the nearest closed pizza box. My son's hand moved faster. He pressed down on the lid with a firmness that surprised even me. He didn't shout, didn't argue, didn't plead. He simply held the box in place, his eyes locked onto hers with a defiance that said more than words ever could. "No. This is mine now." The cousins stared, their mouths half open, slices frozen mid-bite. No one knew what to do. Kids weren't supposed to challenge adults like this, not in our family. But there it was, a 10-year-old boy staring down his aunt, refusing to give up his ground. The silence broke with laughter. My sister chuckled awkwardly, masking her discomfort with humor. "You see this? Drama over dinner," she said to my parents, expecting them to laugh too. But my parents didn't laugh. They were watching my children closely, their faces caught between pride and unease. Because deep down, even they knew, this wasn't just about pizza. My daughter's voice cut through the room next. "Funny how everyone's full when it's not their stomach that's empty," she said, her tone calm, but her words sharp enough to sting. The cousins fidgeted in their chairs, chewing slower now, some even pushing their food around instead of eating. The joy had drained from the meal. Every bite carried guilt. It wasn't enough for my children to be heard. They wanted the others to feel what they felt. The escalation continued. My daughter picked up a slice from one of the cartons. Not to eat it, but to hold it. She dangled it between her fingers, its cheese stretching like a string of temptation, then set it on her plate without taking a bite. She pushed it back and forth across the plate with her fork, scraping the porcelain with a sound that made the others wince. "You can't waste food," my sister barked. My daughter met her eyes. "You wasted us first." It wasn't shouting. It wasn't even loud. But it landed like a hammer. The room fell into a silence so thick you could hear the fizz of the soda cans. My parents shifted uncomfortably. My sister's face reddened. And the cousins looked away, suddenly fascinated by their plates. The tension was unbearable. That's when my son made his next move. He stood up slowly, lifted the closed pizza box from the table, and carried it toward the trash. Gasps filled the room. No one knew if he would actually do it. His cousins cried out, "Don't!" My sister half rose from her chair, her face twisted in shock, but he didn't drop it in. Not yet. He held it above the trash can like an executioner holding a blade, letting the suspense drag out. The cousins stared, wide-eyed, waiting. My daughter leaned back in her chair, arms crossed, a faint smile playing on her lips. This wasn't just about ruining dinner. It was about showing everyone in that room that the rules had changed. My sister snapped, "You put that down right now!" But my son didn't. He looked at his cousins instead, his voice steady. "Remember how good it tasted when you didn't have to wait? Let's see how good it tastes when you think it might disappear." The cousins froze. The food on their plates looked less like dinner and more like treasure about to be stolen. Every bite now carried panic. Chew faster, eat more before it's gone. The room devolved into chaos. The cousins stuffed their mouths, my sister scolded. My parents tried to calm things down. And my kids? They sat there, calm in the storm, orchestrating it. But escalation is never one-sided. My sister wasn't going to sit there and let two children dominate the table. She stood up fully now, her chair scraping loudly against the floor, her voice sharp as glass. "Enough," she shouted. "You two are ruining dinner for everyone." She reached for the box in my son's hands. He pulled it back, just out of reach, his small arms trembling but firm. My daughter stood now too, sliding beside him, her presence doubling his resolve. 2 against 1, and then my daughter said it, the line that changed the entire night. "No, you ruined it the moment you decided we didn't matter." The room froze. It was no longer about pizza or fries. It was no longer about waiting or fairness. It was about dignity, respect, and the raw fury of being dismissed. Those words shattered the thin shell of civility left in the room. My sister's face hardened. "Give me the box." My son tightened his grip. "Make me." It was a standoff now, an aunt against 2 children, adults against kids, hierarchy against rebellion. The cousins watched in horror, my parents in disbelief. The air was electric, ready to snap, and then the unthinkable happened. My son tilted the box. Just slightly, enough for the smell of hot cheese and pepperoni to escape, enough for everyone to see the slices inside slide toward the edge. Gasps erupted. My sister lunged forward, but my daughter held out her arm, blocking her path with a boldness that stunned even me. The message was clear. One more step, and dinner would be gone. The entire family froze, paralyzed by 2 children who had turned waiting into warfare. And in that frozen silence, as my kids stood side by side, guarding the food not to eat but to control, I realized with a chill, this wasn't escalation anymore. This was war strategy, and the next move would decide who really held power in this family. Would my kids go through with their threat, letting the food hit the trash? Or would my sister find a way to wrest control back before the entire dinner collapsed? The standoff at the trash can was unbearable. Every breath in the room was shallow, every movement tense. My son held the box like it was a weapon, and in that moment, it was. Not a weapon to destroy food, but a weapon to control every set of eyes locked on him. The cousins had stopped chewing completely, their half-eaten slices limp in their hands. My sister's face was flushed red, veins tightening at her temples. "This isn't funny anymore," she hissed, her voice trembling with a mix of rage and disbelief. But my kids didn't flinch. My daughter, standing shoulder to shoulder with her brother, looked calm. Too calm for her age. She folded her arms, lifted her chin, and spoke with the chilling precision of someone much older. "Neither is being treated like we don't exist." The words sliced deeper than any shout could. Because it wasn't a tantrum. It wasn't whining. It was truth. Truth delivered with the sharp edge of composure that no one expected from a child. My parents shifted uncomfortably. My father muttered something about letting the kids eat. My mother, softer in tone, urged my sister, "Just let them pick something too. It's not worth this." But my sister was too deep in it now. Her pride was on the line, and pride is heavier than pizza boxes. They can wait their turn like everyone else. She snapped, her eyes never leaving the slices dangling at the edge of the box. But the lie of her words was obvious. They hadn't been waiting their turn. They had been skipped, dismissed, shoved aside for her kids' choices. And now the balance had shifted, the lie exposed. My son's arms trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of everyone's attention pressing down on him. Still, he didn't back down. His eyes flicked to his sister, and she gave the slightest nod. The pact was intact. Then came the move no one expected. My daughter reached out, not for the food, but for the TV remote again. With one press, the wolves returned to the screen, fangs bared, circling their prey, growls vibrating through the speakers. She raised the volume higher this time. The room filled with the sound of the hunt. The symbolism was brutal. They were no longer pretending. The cousins weren't eating dinner anymore. They were prey, feasting under the gaze of predators who had been denied but were now taking control. The cousins squirmed, setting their slices down, suddenly nauseated. The fries that had been golden and irresistible now looked pale, greasy, repulsive under the growls echoing through the room. My sister snapped. She lunged forward, grabbing for the box. My son twisted away, his foot slipping on the tiled floor. But his grip didn't break. For a terrifying second, the box tilted dangerously, slices nearly spilling. Gasps erupted from every corner. My mother's hand flew to her mouth. My father half rose from his chair, but then, the unthinkable. My daughter stepped between her brother and her aunt, her small frame blocking the way. She spread her arms wide, defiant, her voice loud and unshakable. "You don't get to take everything first." The room froze. It wasn't about food anymore. Everyone knew it. These were two children standing against the weight of adults, against hierarchy, against dismissal. They weren't asking for a slice of pizza. They were demanding recognition, demanding fairness, demanding respect. My sister's voice broke, shrill and desperate. "You're ruining dinner." But my daughter's reply cut deeper. "No, you ruined us. Dinner's just the proof." The silence after those words was crushing. My sister's kids stared wide-eyed, their confidence gone, their appetite vanished. My parents exchanged uneasy glances. Even I, sitting there, felt the gravity of the moment pressing down on my chest, because something irreversible had just happened. The children weren't just protesting anymore, they were rewriting the rules. And then came the breaking point. My son tilted the box further. A slice slid over the edge, teetering on the brink. My sister gasped, lunging forward again, but my daughter blocked her, pushing her back with a firmness no one expected. The slice fell. It hit the floor with a soft, greasy slap. The room exploded. My sister shrieked. Her kids cried out. My parents shouted. Chaos erupted like thunder. The box wobbled in my son's hands, but he held it tight, staring at the fallen slice like it was a battle flag planted in the soil. It wasn't waste. It was a message. Every war has a moment when it becomes irreversible, when retreat is no longer possible. That slice on the floor was the line crossed, the bridge burned, the point of no return. My sister's voice cracked with fury. "You think this is a game?" she roared, but my daughter's eyes blazed as she answered, "No, it's justice." The room fell silent again, but this time the silence was different, heavier, final, because everyone realized something terrifying in that moment. These kids weren't bluffing. They were ready to burn the entire dinner to ashes if it meant being seen, and as the wolves howled from the TV, as the cousins sat pale and silent, as my sister stood trembling with rage, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. The war wasn't ending here. The real destruction was just beginning. One slice was gone. But the box still had more. Would my children push it further and take the entire meal down with them? The slice lay on the floor like a fallen soldier, cheese stretched and torn, sauce staining the tile in a red streak that looked almost like blood. My sister's gasp echoed in the room, a sharp intake of breath that carried rage, disbelief, and humiliation all in one. Her kids recoiled as though they'd just witnessed something sacred being desecrated. My parents sat frozen, torn between scolding and silence. The wolves still growled on the TV, their relentless howls underscoring every flicker of tension, making the air feel sharp and electric. My son tightened his grip on the box, his knuckles white, his arms trembling. Not from weakness, but from the strain of holding onto his defiance. My daughter stood guard, her body small but immovable, her gaze fixed on her aunt like she'd been preparing for this fight her whole life. "This ends now," my sister spat, her voice venomous. But my daughter shook her head slowly, deliberately. "No, it starts now." The cousins whimpered, one of them whispering, "Just stop, please." But there was no stopping anymore. The balance of power had shifted, and my kids weren't about to hand it back. My son lifted the box higher, holding it above his head. The message was clear: one move, one step too far, and the entire meal would come crashing down. Every eye in the room followed the tilt of his wrists, the dangerous sway of greasy cardboard. "Don't you dare," my sister warned, her voice shrill, cracking under the weight of desperation. And then my son spoke. His voice was low, steady, and far older than his years. "We've been invisible long enough." The words hung in the air like smoke. My parents looked stricken, my mother blinking back tears, my father rubbing his temple as if the weight of decades had just collapsed on him. "Your children," my sister snapped, her tone defensive now, as though reminding them of their place could undo the revolution sparking before her. But my daughter stepped closer, her eyes unwavering. "Children know when they're being treated like scraps." The TV wolves roared louder as if on cue, the volume creeping up to fill the room with savage energy. And then my son did something no one expected. He pulled a slice from the box, a perfect, cheesy, golden slice, and held it out. Not to himself, not to his sister, but to one of the cousins. Gasps broke out. The cousins' eyes widened, their small hands trembling as they reached out and took it. The slice looked enormous in their hands. Heavy, undeserved. "Eat it," my son said, his voice hard. "But remember who gave it to you?" The cousin hesitated, then slowly took a bite. My sister's face twisted, a storm of emotions fighting for control. Fury, shame, fear, disbelief, because in that moment, her authority shattered. Her children weren't looking at her anymore. They were looking at mine. The box had become more than food. It was power. And my kids had seized it. My daughter stepped forward again, her voice ringing out over the howls of the TV. "You made us wait. You made us feel small. But tonight, you'll never forget that we stood up." The cousins lowered their heads, chewing silently, their guilt written across their faces. My parents said nothing, watching like bystanders at the fall of a regime. My sister shook, her fists clenched, but she didn't move. She couldn't, because the war was already lost. And then, to drive the point home, my son took one final slice from the box. Slowly, deliberately, he dropped it. Not on the floor, but into the trash. The sound was sickeningly final. Cheese slapped against plastic, grease-staining paper. The cousins flinched. My sister staggered back as though struck. "That's what it feels like," my daughter said coldly. "To watch something you wanted, something you thought was yours, be taken away." Silence. Absolute silence. The box was nearly empty now. Just a few slices remained. But the war wasn't about the food anymore. It was about the scar left behind. The cousins wouldn't forget the humiliation. My sister wouldn't forget the loss of control. And my parents, they wouldn't forget the moment their grandkids rewrote the rules of the family table. Finally, my son lowered the box and handed a slice to his sister. They each took one, not gorging, not celebrating, but eating with slow, deliberate bites. The wolves faded from the screen, the documentary ending, but their presence lingered in the room, their hunt echoing in everyone's chest. No one spoke. No one dared. The war was over, but the battlefield was littered with wounds that would never fully heal. And as I watched my kids take those last bites, I realized something chilling. They hadn't just won dinner. They had learned that power could shift, that silence could be broken, that invisibility could be shattered. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something far greater. If a family dinner could collapse into war, what would happen the next time? Because one thing was certain, my children would never be silent again.